Jesus Christ, you actually wore that? Did you get lost on your way to the soup kitchen? The words, sharp and venomous, ripped through the delicate hum of the ballroom. They weren't whispered, they were projected, a deliberate missile of disdain. In the Grand Metropolis Foundation gala at the Zenith Tower, where fortunes were forged and reputations shattered over canapes, a silence fell. It was a vacuum sucking the air out of the room. Heads swiveled, crystal champagne flutes paused halfway to painted lips, and at the heart of this manufactured hurricane stood Brittany Langford, the wonderkind CEO of Vance Innovations, poured into a dress of liquid gold so tight it seemed to defy physics. Her body was a triumph of discipline and surgery, and she brandished it like a weapon. Her laughter, high and brittle, echoed off the marble columns. Her target was a ghost at the feast. Elena Vargas sat alone at a table near the sweeping obsidian windows overlooking the city. She was a study in stillness. Her gown was not the fiery cry for attention favored by the room's occupants. It was a long, sweeping creation of deep indigo silk, the color of a midnight sky just before the stars appear. It didn't glitter, it absorbed the light, gathering power in its quiet folds. Her salt and pepper hair was swept into an elegant, intricate chignon, revealing a neckline unadorned by the colossal diamonds that choked the throats of other women in the room. She was sipping still water, her posture an unbreakable line of grace. To the untrained eye, she was nobody. A wealthy widow, perhaps, a forgotten socialite. But to Brittany Langford, high on her own meteoric rise and the cheap thrill of cruelty, this quiet woman was a perfect canvas on which to paint her dominance. Before the full devastation of this encounter unfolds, we have to ask, where in the world are you joining us from tonight? Drop your city, your state, your country in the comments below. And if you believe that true strength doesn't need to scream to be heard, do us a favor and smash that like button and subscribe to the channel. We live for stories like this, and we're damn glad you're here to witness it. The crowd's reaction was immediate and predatory. A pack of jackals scenting blood. A few nervous titters rippled from Brittany's table, a sycophantic chorus of tech investors and their surgically enhanced wives. A grizzled hedge fund manager, a man who'd shorted entire national economies without blinking, grinned into his scotch, a cruel slash in his weathered face. "Looks like the charity case got a real ticket this year," one woman murmured behind a hand dripping with blood diamonds. Another, a fashion blogger whose influence was as inflated as her lips, chimed in. "That dress is a fireable offense. It's sincere." The word was spat out like an obscenity. The ballroom was no longer a space of elegant celebration. It was a coliseum, and the lions were circling. Elena Vargas did not flinch. She blinked once, a slow, deliberate motion, as if filing the insult away in a vast mental archive. She had heard this tone 1,000 times before. She'd heard it when a venture capitalist told her that her brilliant software proposal was cute, but that she should leave the real business to the men. She'd heard it when a board of directors dismissed her billion-dollar acquisition plan, only to watch a male colleague present the same idea later to thunderous applause. And now, here again, in a room that stank of desperation masked by French perfume, the same entitled sneer, the same dismissal, the same casual attempt to erase her very existence. But the ghosts of 100 such rooms had taught her a patience that was nearly geologic in its scope. Brittany, emboldened, glided closer, the golden fabric of her dress clinging to her hips. Her wine glass, filled with a red so deep it was almost black, swirled dangerously. Her crimson lips, a stark wound in her pale face, twisted into a smile that held no warmth. "Gala couture, sweetheart. You should Google it sometime," she purred, her voice a weaponized caress. "Oh, wait. Maybe the Wi-Fi isn't free where you come from." The gasps, this time, were sharper, more pronounced. The cruelty was no longer a playful jab. It was a public execution. The spectacle had its hooks in the crowd now. Even those who felt a flicker of unease were too captivated to look away. Elena remained motionless. One long, elegant finger traced the condensation on her water glass. It wasn't a nervous tick. It was an act of centering, of drawing a line in the sand that only she could see. Her silence was not a void. It was a pressure chamber. The atmosphere growing denser, heavier, with every passing moment. On the other side of the room, a young freelance journalist named Sophia Hart, who'd snuck in by pretending to be a caterer's assistant, felt her heart pound against her ribs. She surreptitiously angled the clutch bag that concealed her phone's camera. This was more than gossip. This was a cultural flashpoint. A few tables away, Harlan Brooks, a legendary private equity magnate, watched with an unnervingly calm expression. He leaned toward his wife and whispered, "They are poking a sleeping dragon. They mistake serenity for weakness." He knew Elena Vargas, not personally, but by reputation. A reputation built in the silent, brutal boardrooms of international finance, a world far removed from this glittering circus. The seeds of doubt, tiny but potent, were beginning to sprout in the more discerning corners of the room. But the majority remained firmly in Brittany's corner. She was the story of the moment. Young, beautiful, brash, a supernova of new money and media savvy. Elena, by contrast, was old-world power, a quiet gravitational force you don't feel until you realize you're already caught in its orbit. Brittany's laughter sharpened, taking on a desperate edge. "Tell me, darling, whoever you are," she said, leaning down until her perfume, an aggressive floral scent, enveloped Elena's table. "Did you slip past the guards, hoping to find a rich husband to solve all your problems?" Finally, Elena looked up. Her eyes, the color of dark, rich soil, met Brittany's. There was no anger in them. There was no fear. There was only a profound, bottomless weariness. And something else, something cold and ancient, like the darkness at the bottom of the ocean. Her voice, when it came, was soft, a mere whisper that somehow commanded the entire room's attention. It was so perfectly measured, it felt like a vault door sliding shut. "I already met him," she said. The ballroom held its breath. For a split second, the statement hung in the air, a cryptic puzzle. Brittany frowned, her perfectly sculpted brows furrowing in confusion. But Elena Vargas knew precisely what she had said, and she knew the storm she had just summoned was only beginning to gather its strength. The Metropolis Foundation Gala was not merely a party. It was the apex of the city's social and financial food chain. Held annually in the Zenith Tower's Grand Ballroom, an opulent space high above the glittering carpet of city lights, it was a high-stakes ritual disguised as a celebration. The air, thick with the scent of orchids and expensive champagne, was charged with the kinetic energy of ambition and old money. Every guest was a player, their attire a carefully chosen armor. Diamonds were not just jewelry, they were balance sheets. Gowns worth more than a suburban home were not just fashion, they were declarations of intent. And then there was Elena Vargas. She had arrived without fanfare. No team of publicists, no cacophony of camera flashes, no hulking security guards carving a path for her through the crowd. She simply materialized, a singular presence, a point of stillness in a sea of frantic motion. Her indigo silk gown flowed around her like captured twilight. It did not shout its value with sequins or feathers. It emanated a quiet authority, the kind of luxury that has nothing to prove. Her hair, a distinguished silver streak, was a masterpiece of understated elegance. Minimal jewelry, a pair of simple pearl earrings, a slender watch, adorned her. This lack of ostentation was not an oversight. It was a strategy. Tonight she had not come to be seen. She had come to observe, to measure, to feel the currents of the room that had so often tried to drown her. Across that same ballroom, Brittany Langford made damn sure everyone saw her. She was the textbook definition of disruptive. Her empire, Vance Innovations, was built less on sustainable technology and more on sensational headlines and venture capital hype. Tonight, she was not a CEO. She was a spectacle. Her liquid gold dress was a second skin, clinging to every curve, scattering light like a dying star. Her stiletto heels were so high they were a feat of engineering. Each step a carefully calibrated performance. Every toss of her platinum blonde hair was for an unseen camera. She didn't just crave the spotlight. She needed it. She fed on it, and she could not tolerate anyone who refused to play her blindingly bright game. That refusal was Elena Vargas. The whispers followed Elena as she moved to her table. Who let her in? So plain. Did she come from a funeral? Is that silk? How dreadfully traditional. The assumptions were a tired old script passed down through generations of rooms just like this one. Rooms where a woman of quiet confidence, a woman who did not perform femininity in the expected way, was immediately categorized as irrelevant, invisible, or an interloper. Elena had been walking into these rooms her entire life, and every single time she chose the same shield, the same weapon, an unreachable, unshakable calm. Brittany, however, saw that calm as a vacuum, and it was her nature to fill every vacuum with her own noise. Weakness was prey, and she was a predator. She made certain her mocking laugh carried across the ballroom. She gestured toward Elena for the benefit of her table of hedge fund wives and their diamond chokers. For her, this was a blood sport, a public dissection of an anomaly who dared to defy the room's unspoken rules. But what Brittany Langford, in her gilded ignorance, could not possibly comprehend was that Elena operated under a different set of rules entirely. She didn't chase the cameras. She owned the companies that manufactured them. She didn't need to sparkle. She signed the checks that powered the city's electrical grid. Her influence was not in the headlines. It was in the bedrock of the economy, a quiet tectonic power that could cause earthquakes without ever making a sound. And one of her company's smaller, more recent investments, a quiet acquisition through a third-party subsidiary, was a significant life-sustaining stake in a floundering tech firm called Vance Innovations. Elena sat with her back straight, her spine a column of steel, her eyes following the movements of the jazz quintet on the stage. Her stillness wasn't a retreat. It was a methodical gathering of data. Every smirk, every whispered insult, every patronizing glance was being recorded, indexed, and filed away. Not with anger, not with shame, but with the cold, dispassionate precision of a forensic accountant examining a fraudulent ledger. She had been physically escorted from a shareholders' meeting because the security guard refused to believe she was the majority shareholder she claimed to be. She didn't argue. She simply returned the next day with her lawyers and had the entire board of directors removed. Now the cycle had returned. Another ballroom, another gatekeeper, this one clad in gold sequins instead of a security uniform. But this time she wasn't just the shareholder. She was the house. Brittany raised her glass again, her lips stained with wine and arrogance. "Maybe next year you'll dress for the job you want, not the one you have," she called out, winking at her friends. Elena finally looked up from the stage. Her eyes were placid, and a serene, almost imperceptible smile touched the corners of her lips. She didn't speak. She didn't have to. The room for the moment had cast its vote. This was entertainment. This was the show. But for Elena Vargas, this was merely discovery. The evidence was being presented, and the night was far from over. The saxophone's lament curled through the air, a ribbon of smooth, expensive melancholy. But Brittany's voice sliced through it, sharp and jarring. She leaned against a gilded ice sculpture of a swan, her glass in her hand, her eyes locked on Elena like a hawk on a field mouse. She'd found her evening's entertainment. "Excuse me," she called out, her voice loud enough to make the event's MC standing by the stage flinch. "I was told this was an exclusive event. Is that still the case? Because the guest list seems to have gotten a little porous." A ripple of laughter followed, quiet at first, then growing in confidence as Brittany's sycophants took their cue. Heads turned more overtly now, no longer hiding their curiosity. They stared at Elena's solitary table. Elena did not acknowledge them. Her gaze remained fixed on the flickering candle flame at her table's center, as if it were the most fascinating thing in the world. Brittany smirked, fueled by the reaction. She was an addict, and attention was her drug. She raised her voice again, this time theatrically turning to her friends. "I'm just saying maybe someone should check her credentials. Security? Is this woman even on the list?" Gasps. Murmurs. The phrase, "not on the list," was a social death sentence in a room built on exclusion. It was the ultimate damnation. Instantly, the crowd began to weave a narrative around the woman in indigo. She was a gatecrasher. She was a vendor's plus one who'd wandered out of the service corridors. She was a professional grifter, an ambitious nobody hoping to network her way into a life she didn't deserve. The narrative wasn't true, but it was easy. It was far easier than confronting the ugly bias that underpinned it. At a corner table, Sophia Hart frowned, her thumb pressing the record button on her hidden phone. She knew exactly what she was witnessing. It was a high-tech lynching, a ritualistic humiliation disguised as sophisticated banter, and she was going to get all of it. Elena took a sip of water. The glass was steady in her hand, the movement was unhurried. Brittany, however, was just getting started. She now turned her full body toward Elena, letting her golden dress catch every single spotlight, a blinding flare of arrogance. "Sweetheart," she said, her voice dripping with poison, "if you're lost, the service entrance is that way." She pointed a long, blood-red fingernail toward the back of the room. That dress would be perfect for carrying a tray of canapés. The laughter that erupted this time was sharp and ugly. Someone actually clapped. The hedge fund manager nearly choked on his scotch. For Elena, the moment stretched. She could hear the echo of her younger self standing in the rain outside a university gala. A doorman's sneering face telling her, "This is a private event, not for people like you." She remembered the searing sting of that humiliation, the long, silent walk back to her dorm. She remembered the vow she had whispered into the cold night air. "One day I will own the rooms they throw me out of." And here she was. Same sneering arrogance, different face, same gilded cage. But she was no longer the girl in the rain. She was the architect of empires, the unseen hand on the levers of power, sitting in silent witness as ignorance crowned itself queen. She did not react. Her silence was both a shield and a sword, though no one else in the room could yet tell the difference. Brittany lifted her chin, reveling in what she perceived as her triumph. She was addicted to this feeling of validation, and tonight she was getting an intoxicating dose. Her laugh rang out again, as bright and empty as her diamond earrings. This was victory for Brittany. This was deposition. The evidence was mounting. Sophia Hart scribbled furiously on her phone's notepad, capturing every word. "Across the room," Harlan Brooks whispered again to his wife, his brow furrowed now. "They mock her for her composure, but her composure is the most dangerous thing in this room. She is not absorbing the attack. She is baiting the trap." The ballroom continued to buzz, drunk on champagne and casual cruelty. The fine line between entertainment and abuse had been completely erased, and Elena Vargas, the woman in midnight silk, a silent island in a sea of noise, simply let the room continue to dig its own grave. The loud, overt laughter died down, replaced by a low, persistent hum of whispers. The jazz quintet, professional to a fault, played on, but the gravitational center of the high ballroom had irrevocably shifted. Every eye, whether furtively or openly, was now fixed on Elena Vargas, and still she did nothing. She said nothing. Her hand rested on the stem of her water glass, her fingers relaxed. It was not a gesture of tension, but of profound stillness, as if it were the anchor holding the entire world in place. Her regal posture never wavered. Her back remained a straight, elegant line. To the casual observer, she was simply weathering the storm. She seemed stoic, perhaps even cowed. But to the few who were truly watching, Sophia in the corner, Harlan Brooks across the room, it was incandescently clear this was not passivity. This was an active strategic exercise of immense control. Brittany felt a flicker of impatience. This wasn't right. She was used to reactions. She expected tears or a shouting match, or at the very least, a mortified, pleading apology from someone desperate to regain her favor. Silence was a language she didn't speak. It unnerved her. It was not surrender. It was something else, something she couldn't categorize and therefore couldn't control. She sauntered closer, her golden dress rustling with malevolence, her voice laced with cutting sarcasm. "What's the matter? Cat got your tongue, darling? Or are you just not used to speaking unless you're taking an order?" Still nothing. Elena lifted her glass, took a single, perfectly measured sip of water, and placed it back on the white linen tablecloth. The base of the glass made no sound. Not a single drop was spilled. It was an act of impossible poise, and the room registered it. That level of control wasn't learned. It was forged in the crucible of 1,000 hostile encounters. It was the hard-won armor of a lifetime spent navigating rooms designed to break her. Sophia's fingers flew across her phone screen. She doesn't react. She absorbs. She disarms. This was better than she could have ever imagined. Within the silent fortress of Elena's mind, the insults replayed on a loop. "You don't belong." "Soup kitchen dress." "Service entrance." They were not fresh wounds. They were the familiar ghosts of 1,000 old scars. But tonight, she wasn't here to engage in a battle of wits. She was not here to win a skirmish. She was here to end the entire war. Her silence began to act as a psychic mirror. The more she refused to engage, the more the harsh glare of the spotlight drifted back onto Brittany, and with it came a new level of scrutiny. Guests who had eagerly laughed just moments before now began to shift uncomfortably. A few glanced at each other with newfound unease. The joke, stretched out for so long, had lost its punch. It no longer seemed clever or sharp. It seemed desperate, needy. Brittany's brilliant smile wavered for a fraction of a second. She masked it almost instantly, tossing her blonde hair, letting her diamonds catch the light in a practiced gesture of distraction. But the crack had appeared, a tiny fissure in the flawless facade. At that exact moment, Elena's eyes lifted at last. They were calm, steady, and utterly unreadable. She didn't speak, but the sheer weight of her gaze landed on Brittany like a physical blow. For a single heartbeat, the room felt a silence heavier than any applause, louder than any ridicule. Harlan Brooks whispered to his wife, his voice tinged with awe. "She is not ignoring the storm. She is becoming it." And he was right. For Elena Vargas, silence wasn't the absence of a response. It was the response. Every sneer, every laugh, every condescending word was a brick she allowed Brittany to hand her, and she was letting her build a tower, brick by ignorant brick, that was growing far too heavy for its architect to bear. When the moment was right, that tower would collapse, and it would not be Elena who was buried beneath the rubble. From the periphery of the ballroom, Sophia Hart subtly adjusted the position of her clutch. Inside, her phone's camera lens, peeking through a cunningly disguised slit in the fabric, was capturing it all: the glint in Brittany's eye, the curl of her lip, the slow, dawning horror on the faces of the guests who were starting to understand. She hadn't come looking for a scandal. She'd been sent to get glossy, superficial photos of billionaires in their native habitat. But what she was documenting was not glamour. It was a brutal, primeval power play. And cruelty of this magnitude in a room this full of influence was front-page news. She double-checked that she was still recording. 2 tables away, Harlan Brooks studied the unfolding drama with the cool, detached analysis of a master chess player. His wife leaned toward him, her fan fluttering nervously. "Why are they so cruel to her?" she whispered. "Because they are blind," he replied quietly, never taking his eyes off Elena. He then paused, adding, "Or worse. Perhaps they see exactly who she is, and it terrifies them." I had encountered Elena only once before, across a polished mahogany table during a brutal negotiation for a shipping conglomerate. She had been the same then, quiet, deliberate. Every word she uttered was weighed and measured, every moment of silence a tactical move. He remembered walking away from that meeting, a deal in his favor, yet with the distinct feeling that he had won only because she had permitted it. He knew one thing with absolute certainty. Elena Vargas did not waste her breath. If she was choosing not to speak now, it was for a devastatingly precise reason. Across the ballroom, the whispers were beginning to change their tone. No longer were they all in mockery. Unease was spreading like a virus. "Wait, I think I've seen her picture in Forbes," one woman whispered to her partner. "Isn't that the CEO of Ethel Red Holdings?" Her partner frowned. "No, couldn't be. Elena Vargas wouldn't be sitting by herself, and she wouldn't dress so plainly." He stopped himself mid-sentence, because even as he voiced the denial, a cold dread began to prickle his skin. The possibility was too unsettling. Sophia caught it all. The shifting whispers, the uncertain glances, the slow, seismic pivot of the crowd's mood, from vicious amusement to anxious doubt. She typed a note to herself. Power isn't the loudest voice in the room. It's the one that can change the room's atmosphere without uttering a single word. Brittany, of course, was oblivious to these subtle shifts. She was high on the drug of her own perceived power, swirling her wine, basking in the spotlight of her own creation. For her, the night was a coronation. She believed every smirk in the room was a tribute to her. But the camera was watching, the investor was watching, and the potent, weaponized silence that Elena wielded was quietly rewriting the entire narrative. The gala's host, Derek Hale, a real estate billionaire with a ludicrously large bow tie, glanced over from the head table. A frown tugged at his surgically tightened face. He recognized Elena now, vaguely at first, then with a sickening jolt of clarity. Her name on contracts that had made him hundreds of millions, her company's signature on deals that propped up half the businesses in this room. And yet he remained silent. Paralyzed by social cowardice, he simply watched, morbidly curious to see just how far Brittany would push it. And so the scene was set. A woman in midnight silk, a fortress of calm, A woman in liquid gold, laughing too loudly, completely unaware of the abyss opening up beneath her designer heels. And surrounding them, a circle of witnesses, some complicit, some skeptical, and some just beginning to realize they were watching a public suicide in real time. The evidence was all in. The trial was about to begin. The jazz quintet swung into a brighter, more optimistic melody, a cascade of violin notes falling on a room that had no ear for it. The real music was the suffocating tension coiled at the center of the ballroom. Brittany Langford stood with the easy posture of a predator that knows its prey is trapped. Her golden dress shimmered, a warning flare of her own impending doom. She raised her crystal glass of dark red wine, her eyes never leaving Elena. "Well," she announced, her voice a brassy trumpet call meant for the entire assembly, "if silence is your only defense, then I propose a toast to nothing at all." She stepped forward closer this time, far too close. The crowd parted around her like water cleaving before the prow of a ship. Her stiletto heels clicked a sharp, menacing rhythm on the polished marble floor. She came to a halt beside Elena's table, her shadow falling over the pristine white cloth. The other guests, now a tight circle of voyeurs, pretended to chat amongst themselves while leaning in, straining to hear, to see. Brittany leaned over, her smile as sharp and thin as a shard of glass. She lowered her wine glass, tilting it ever so slightly over the deep indigo fabric of Elena's gown. "You should be careful," she said, her voice a sickly sweet whisper. "It would be a tragedy if someone made a mistake and ruined that drab little dress of yours." And then it happened. It was not a spill, it was a pronouncement. A deliberate, contemptuous tilt of her wrist, a fluid motion disguised as a clumsy accident. A slow, viscous ribbon of scarlet wine cascaded down, soaking into Elena's lap, staining the midnight silk like blood blooming on a dark sea. A collective gasp went through the room. A woman covered her mouth, her eyes wide with shock. A man muttered, "Dear God, she actually did it." Another guest let out a choked, nervous laugh, unsure if this was the punchline or a declaration of war. Brittany straightened up, feigning a theatrical innocence, one hand flying to her chest. "Oh my," she chirped, her voice dripping with mockery. "How terribly clumsy of me. I do hope dry cleaning isn't too expensive on your salary." The uneasy, fractured laughter that followed was her last taste of victory. Elena did not move. She simply looked down at the rapidly spreading stain, then slowly back up at Brittany. Her face was a mask of utter calm. Her breathing was slow and even. There was no flicker of rage, no tremor of humiliation, only a silence that was now sharper, more dangerous than any sound. Sophia's pen nearly ripped through the napkin she was scribbling on. "Poured wine on her. Intentional. Got it on film." Harlan Brooks leaned closer to his wife. "This is not humiliation," he murmured, his voice grim. "This is self-immolation. The girl in gold has no idea what she has just ignited." Brittany, drunk on her own performance and half a bottle of expensive Cabernet, failed to read the seismic shift in the room's atmosphere. She saw only the spotlight she believed was hers alone. She giggled, tossing her hair back, a triumphant glint in her eyes. "You know," she sneered, "I think red is a much better color on you." But the room no longer laughed with her. The cruelty had finally crossed an invisible line. It had escalated from vicious banter to physical assault. Dressed in haute couture, guests were no longer looking at Elena with mockery. They were looking at her with a dawning sense of dread, of curiosity, of doubt. They were looking at her, and they were wondering. Elena picked up her linen napkin and placed it gently over the wine stain, not as if to hide it, but as if to mark the spot, to catalog the insult. Her hand moved with a calm precision that was terrifying to behold. And in that heavy, loaded silence, the energy of the ballroom finally, irrevocably, tipped. Those who had mocked began to feel the first cold winds of a gathering storm. Those who had doubted began to question their own allegiances. And those few who had been watching closely, the journalist, the investor, the host, knew with absolute certainty that this was no accident. Brittany Langford had just signed her own death warrant, and she'd done it in front of 100 witnesses. The ballroom had grown heavy, a palpable tension pressing down from the frescoed ceilings. The spilled wine glistened like a fresh wound on Elena's gown, the stain a dark accusing eye staring up at the crowd. Conversations died in people's throats. The laughter was gone, replaced by a nervous, shuffling silence. What had been a cruel spectacle just moments ago now felt like a crime scene. But Brittany Langford was not done. She had a thirst for spectacle, and tonight she was determined to see her victory etched into the very soul of this room. "Security!" Brittany's voice, high and shrill, rang out, sharp enough to make the violinist's bows skid across their strings. She waved her hand dripping with rings like a petulant queen dismissing a serf. "Someone, please escort this woman out of here. She is a disturbance. She is clearly not supposed to be here." The gasps were louder this time, tinged with a new note of horror. People were no longer just uncomfortable. They were appalled. Even the waiters, trained to be invisible, froze with silver trays in their hands. Sophia's camera caught every second, her own hand trembling as she whispered into her sleeve, "Oh my God, she's actually doubling down." Two hulking security guards stationed discreetly by the main entrance exchanged an uncertain glance. They had been given a strict list, but the woman in indigo, despite the stain on her dress, carried herself with an aura of authority that made the accusations feel wrong. Still, Brittany Langford was a major donor. An order from her was not to be taken lightly. They began to make their way slowly, deliberately, through the now parting crowd. Brittany smiled, a thin, satisfied smile of pure malice. She had won. She leaned toward her table of friends, whispering just loudly enough for everyone nearby to hear. "Some people just refuse to understand their place. This is a billionaire's gala, not a homeless shelter." A few of her sycophants managed a weak, strained chuckle. It was a pathetic, dying echo of the laughter that had filled the room just minutes before. People were backing away, distancing themselves from the toxic radius around Brittany. Elena did not flinch. She did not rise to defend herself. She simply adjusted the linen napkin covering her stained gown, her fingers precise, as if each movement was a piece of sworn testimony. Her face was serene, her eyes lowered, but her silence was the thunder rolling in from a distant horizon. Harlan Brooks whispered to his wife, his voice now sharp with anticipation. "This is it. She is going to regret this for the rest of her life." His wife nodded, her eyes wide, sensing the air crackling with an inevitable electric discharge. Derek Hale, the billionaire host, finally began to stir, a sheen of sweat on his forehead. The name Ethel Red Holdings was now flashing in his mind like a neon warning sign, signatures on contracts, boardroom negotiations. He opened his mouth to intervene, to stop this catastrophic miscalculation, but then he hesitated. Part of him, the craven, curious part, wanted to see it through. He remained rooted to his spot by a paralyzing cocktail of fear and fascination. The two security guards arrived at Elena's table. They were massive men, but they seemed diminished in her quiet presence. One leaned in, his voice a low, apologetic rumble. "Ma'am, we have to ask you to come with us." The room held a collective breath. 100 phones, not even trying to be discreet anymore, were raised. 100 pairs of eyes, 100 silent judgments, all converged on the lone, still woman in indigo. Brittany smirked, her lips curling in triumph. "Yes, darling," she cooed, her voice a poisonous confection of fake sweetness. "It's time for you to leave. You don't belong here." For the first time all evening, Elena lifted her gaze fully. Her eyes met Brittany's, and she did not blink. Her stare was calm, steady, and as ancient as a monolith. And in that silent, loaded stare, the entire crowd felt a transfer of power so profound, so absolute that it was almost a physical force. The storm had finally made landfall. The ballroom was a frozen tableau. The guards waited. The crowd leaned in. Brittany basked in the glow of her Pyrrhic victory. And then Elena moved, not with rage, not with fear, but with the cold, deliberate precision of a surgeon. She reached for the small, elegant clutch at her side. She opened it, the clasp clicking shut with a sound that seemed to echo in the silent room. She withdrew her phone. One swipe of her thumb, one tap on the screen. She lifted the phone to her ear, her voice as smooth and unhurried as flowing silk, yet carrying the unmistakable weight of command. "Antonia," she said, her voice cutting through the silence, "initiate Protocol 7. Every syllable landed like a judge's gavel. The guards paused, their hands hovering uselessly at their sides. They exchanged confused glances, sensing a shift into a reality they were not equipped to understand. Brittany let out a dismissive, bubbling laugh. "Oh, this is rich. What are you doing? Calling an Uber to take you back to the gutter?" she sneered, tossing her hair. A few of her friends managed a weak chuckle, but the sound was hollow, uncertain. "On the other end of the line," a crisp, efficient voice replied instantly, audible only to Elena. But the effect was immediate. "At once, Miss Vargas, the Vance Innovations contract is on my screen." Sophia's eyes went wide. She'd heard the name Blackwood, Vargas. Her fingers flew across her notes, her mind racing, connecting the dots. Elena Vargas, CEO, Ethel Red Holdings, the ghost of Wall Street, the woman they called the Silent Shark. Harlan Brooks sat bolt upright, a slow knowing smile spreading across his face. He knew, of course he knew. Protocol 7. It was the stuff of boardroom legend. Ethel's emergency liquidation clause, a corporate doomsday device. The rest of the crowd, however, was still catching up. They hovered in a state of suspended animation, watching the woman in indigo with a mixture of bewilderment and morbid fascination. Elena continued, her voice still quiet, but so resonant that the nearest tables heard every word with chilling clarity. "Effective immediately. Terminate the bridge loan. Prepare the withdrawal documents for all subsidiary funding. Freeze all ongoing negotiations and put an immediate hold on all pending wire transfers to Vance Innovations and its affiliates." A hush fell that was so absolute it felt like the world had stopped turning. The jazz quintet faltered, their instruments falling silent one by one as they realized the real performance had nothing to do with them. The silence was thick, oppressive, pregnant with the terrifying unseen movement of immense power. Brittany scoffed, her crimson lips twisting in a desperate attempt to maintain control. "What is this, a community theater performance? Do you really think making a phone call suddenly makes you important? You are embarrassing yourself, darling. Just get out." But her words had lost all their venom. They fell flat, pathetic little darts against an armored fortress. The energy in the room had not just shifted, it had inverted. Guests who had laughed now exchanged looks of dawning horror. The name Vargas began to move through the room in hushed, panicked whispers. "Did she say Vargas? As in Elena Vargas, the one who owns half of downtown?" Derek Hale, the host, finally rose, his golden bow tie looking like a hangman's noose. His voice was a low, urgent whisper to those around him. If that is Elena Vargas, Brittany Langford just ended her own career. Elena ended the call. She placed her phone carefully back into its clutch, the snap of the clasp echoing like a gunshot. She then looked up, not at the stunned security guards, not at the horrified crowd, but directly, unblinkingly, at Brittany. Her voice was calm, almost gentle, which made the words all the more devastating. "You just tried to humiliate the woman who holds the mortgage on your entire future." The words needed no volume. They derived their power from the chasm of silence that followed, and in that silence, Brittany's cruel smirk finally completely dissolved. For the first time all night, she looked uncertain. She looked afraid. The balance had not just shifted, the entire board had been flipped over. The atmosphere in the ballroom had turned crystalline, so fragile it felt as though a single loud breath could shatter it. Brittany Langford still stood over Elena Vargas, her liquid gold dress now looking less like a symbol of power and more like a cheap, gaudy costume. Her face, a canvas that had been painted with such smug cruelty, was now pale, vacant. The crowd, a restless, whispering sea of shock, waited. They sensed a conclusion was at hand, a final brutal judgment. Elena did not need them to wait long. She rose from her chair, a slow, fluid motion of undeniable grace. Her chair did not scrape against the marble. It glided back silently. The indigo silk of her gown shimmered, catching the light from the chandeliers, and the dark wine stain was no longer a mark of humiliation. It was a battle standard, a wound she had refused to hide. With every inch she rose, her presence seemed to expand, growing heavier, filling the space around her. She did not raise her voice. She had no need for such crude instruments. "My name," she began, her calm, steady gaze sweeping across the circle of stunned, upturned faces, "is Elena Vargas." The whispers caught fire, erupting into a cascade of frantic recognition. "Vargas! Oh my God, it's Elena Vargas of Ethel Red Holdings." Elena's eyes locked onto Brittany's. Her gaze was cool, dispassionate, final. "And tonight," she continued, each word a perfectly polished stone dropped into a deep well, "you chose to mock the woman holding the pen to your future. I am the CEO of Ethel Red Holdings. I am the principal financier of the Vance Innovations merger, the multi-billion-dollar deal that is the only thing keeping your vapid little empire from collapsing into a pile of debt." The words landed with the force of a physical explosion. The collective gasp of the crowd was a tangible thing. Glasses clattered. A waiter dropped an entire tray of champagne flutes. The sound of shattering crystal, a fitting underscore to the scene. Someone at the back of the crowd muttered, "Oh my God." Another much louder voice exclaimed, "She owns her!" Brittany Langford's face was now completely drained of color. Her perfect blood-red lips parted, but no sound came out. For the first time since she burst onto the scene, the prodigy of tech, the darling of the media, she looked small. She looked like a flame drowning in its own smoke. Elena took a single step forward, and the crowd receded from her as if she were emanating an invisible force field. Her voice carried without effort. "You poured wine on me. You called security on me. You told me to my face that I do not belong here. But let me tell you the truth, Ms. Langford. Without me, you do not belong. Without my signature, Vance Innovation ceases to exist before the sun rises." Phones were now raised high, a forest of lenses openly, feverishly recording every syllable. Sophia's heart hammered against her ribs as she whispered into her phone's microphone, her voice trembling. She just flipped the entire script. This isn't a story. This is history. Harlan Brooks smiled faintly, a gleam of pure intellectual satisfaction in his eyes. "I told you," he murmured to his wife, who was now staring, utterly captivated. She was not waiting. She was calculating. Around the ballroom, faces were transforming. Smirks had been replaced with awe. Patronizing amusement had turned to raw fear and a newfound desperate respect. Guests who had snickered minutes earlier now stood ramrod straight, trying to project an air of sober disapproval, as if they had been on Elena's side all along. Derek Hale, the host, tugged nervously at his bow tie, a sinking realization dawning that the gala he had meticulously orchestrated had just become the stage for Elena Vargas's masterclass in corporate warfare. Brittany stumbled back a step, her heel catching on the hem of her own impossibly tight dress. She tried to recover, her voice a pathetic, broken thing. This is insane. You're bluffing." But Elena didn't even blink. She leaned in just enough for her next words to feel like an intimate execution, her tone soft, almost lethal. "Check your phone." Brittany's clutch buzzed violently in her hand. She fumbled with the clasp, her fingers shaking uncontrollably. And when she finally wrestled her phone free and looked at the screen, a low, guttural sound escaped her throat. The blood visibly drained from her face. A dozen alerts from her CFO, her lawyers, her board members. The deal was dead. Terminated, withdrawn. And in that moment of devastating digital finality, the woman in the midnight indigo gown was not just a guest at a gala. She was the storm itself. The profound silence she had weaponized all night finally revealed itself for what it truly was. Power, unspeakable, untheatrical, absolute power, waiting patiently for its moment to strike. Elena Vargas had not just arrived, she had taken possession. Brittany Langford's signature laughter, the sound she had used to bludgeon the room into submission all night, was gone. It had been replaced by a choked, rasping sound, a throat clenched tight with panic. The gold sequins on her dress no longer glittered with defiant energy. They seemed to tremble with her, cheap and gaudy. The wine glass she still held shook so violently that she had to set it down on a nearby table where it clinked loudly against the marble. Her face, once a perfect mask of smug confidence, was now a portrait of raw, unadulterated terror. The entire ballroom saw it. Every guest who had smirked, whispered, or chuckled at her cruel jests now looked on with a mixture of fear and fascination. Some looked away, ashamed of their complicity. Others busied themselves with their phones, pretending they hadn't just been part of the jeering mob. It was too late. The room had already chosen its new queen, and it was not Brittany Langford. The billionaire host, Derek Hale, finally cleared his throat, his voice weak and unsteady. "Miss Vargas," he started, but the words died on his lips. What could he possibly say? The definitive statement had already been made. Anything else was just an echo. "Across the room!" Sophia Hart whispered into her recorder, her hands trembling with a rush of pure adrenaline. She's not just in control, she is systematically dismantling her piece by piece in real time. This isn't a scene from a movie. This is a verdict. Brittany took a shaky, desperate step forward. Her voice, when it came out, was cracked and pleading. Listen, it was a misunderstanding. It was a joke that went too far. We're all here to have a good time. No. Elena's single word cut through the room with the finality of a guillotine. It was calm, low, yet it silenced everything. Even the last vestiges of nervous murmuring ceased, as if a switch had been flipped. Elena's eyes, cold and clear, fixed on Brittany. You were not joking. You were performing an act of public humiliation because you thought I was powerless. You called security because you genuinely believed I didn't belong. You poured wine on me because you mistook your cruelty for strength and my silence for weakness. And now, Elena said, her voice dropping even lower, drawing everyone in, the truth is standing right in front of you. Do you still feel powerful, Miss Langford? Brittany opened her mouth, a fish gasping for air, but nothing came out. Her body language was a complete capitulation. Her arms crossed over her chest, a futile attempt to protect herself. Her shoulders, once thrown back with arrogance, were now slumped in defeat. The golden dress that had screamed dominance now looked like a costume for a part she could no longer play. Harlan Brooks spoke, his voice carrying clearly in the hushed room. That is the fundamental flaw of arrogance. It is blind to the moment it has already lost. Heads turned toward him, and a wave of quiet, affirmative nods rippled through the assembled guests. The crowd's pivot was now complete and visible. A woman dripping in diamonds, who had laughed the loudest at Brittany's insults, now raised her champagne flute slightly toward Elena, a gesture of silent, abrupt apology. The waiters, once frozen with indecision, began to move again, but their movements now had a new purpose. They subtly cleared away the empty glasses from the tables near Brittany, as if cleansing the area of her toxic presence. One of them discreetly appeared at Elena's elbow, pouring her a fresh glass of water. It was a small act, but it was a realignment of service, a recognition of where the true power now resided. Desperate, Brittany turned to the small circle of friends who had been her loyal chorus all evening. Say something, she pleaded, her eyes wide. Tell her. But they looked away. They studied their shoes. They checked their phones. One by one, they took a small step back, then another, physically and metaphorically distancing themselves from her. Her entire empire of validation, built on intimidation and fear, crumbled in a matter of seconds, not with a bang, but with a profoundly damning silence. Elena did not smile. She did not gloat. There was no victory in her expression, only a quiet, weary resolve. She simply stood, tall and unwavering, her indigo gown now more radiant and regal than every sequin in the room combined. The wine stain was no longer a blemish. It was a medal, a testament to a battle fought and won, not with noise but with an unbreakable sense of self. Sophia whispered again, her voice breaking with awe. She flipped the entire room without raising her voice. Brittany is an island, a queen with no court. And indeed, in the glittering heart of the grand ballroom, surrounded by 100 smartphone cameras, a constellation of diamonds, and a universe of silence, Brittany Langford was no longer the star of the show. She was the cautionary tale, a spectacular supernova collapsing into a black hole right before everyone's eyes. Elena Vargas hadn't just entered the room, she now owned it. The ballroom held its breath, suspended in the aftermath of Brittany's spectacular self-immolation. The opulent chandeliers still dripped their golden light, but it no longer seemed to celebrate. It illuminated a reckoning. The light did not belong to Brittany anymore. It belonged to the woman in midnight indigo who stood at the center of the storm she had both endured and commanded. Elena's hands were steady, clasped lightly in front of her. She didn't need to speak loudly. Every ear in the vast room strained to catch her words. Every phone was a silent witness. I came here tonight for a quiet evening, Elena began, her tone calm, measured, professorial. I did not ask for the spotlight. I did not demand attention, but arrogance, I find, has a way of forcing dignity into the open. She turned her head slightly, her gaze sweeping over the glittering assembly, addressing not just Brittany, but every single person in the room. You, Miss Langford, wanted to know if I belonged here. You made it your personal mission to prove that I did not. So allow me to provide you and everyone else with some clarity. I do not merely belong in this room. On a very real level, I own this room." She paused, letting the statement sink in. "My company, Ethel Red Holdings, is not just the principal financier of the Vance merger. It is also the majority stakeholder in the parent company that owns this hotel and holds the note on the real estate development group that built this entire tower." Gasps rippled through the room, louder and more shocked than before. This was beyond a business dispute. This was a display of power on a scale they could barely comprehend. "So, when I speak of the multi-billion-dollar sum keeping your company alive, Ms. Langford, understand that it is merely one small entry in a very large ledger, billions of reasons why your corporation draws breath tomorrow." A new wave of frantic whispers erupted. "She controls the whole deal. She owns the building. She could end Vance Innovations tonight." Elena's eyes swept the room again, pausing on the ashen-faced host, on the stunned investors, on Sophia Hart, scribbling with frantic, desperate energy. "And as of this moment," she said, her voice as cool and final as a glacier, "that deal no longer exists. I am officially canceling the merger, effective immediately." The words struck the room like a physical blow. The crowd didn't just gasp, they erupted. People shouted into their phones, frantically alerting their offices, their partners, their brokers. The digital nervous system of the financial world lit up with the news. Sophia nearly dropped her phone, whispering hoarsely, "She just publicly executed a multi-billion-dollar corporation. Live!" Brittany staggered forward, her face a pale, ghostly mask beneath the chandeliers. "No!" she rasped, the single word a shard of desperation. You can't do that. Do you have any idea what you're doing? You'll ruin me. You'll ruin everything." Elena cut her off with nothing more than a glance. Her calm was a terrifying, unshakable force. Her authority was absolute. "I know precisely what I'm doing," she said. "I am exercising a fiduciary duty to my shareholders. I am removing my name, my capital, and my power from any association with an entity led by someone who mistakes cruelty for character. Deals built on the unstable foundation of arrogance are destined to collapse under their own weight. I am simply expediting the process." The ballroom buzzed, no longer with cruelty, but with a potent mixture of shock, awe, and a strange primal admiration. Harlan Brooks nodded firmly, raising his own glass in a clear public salute to Elena. "That," he said, his voice ringing with conviction, "is what true leadership looks like." A few other guests followed suit, then more, a silent, spreading ripple of raised glasses acknowledging the master stroke they had just witnessed. Brittany's hands shook as she clutched her phone, endlessly refreshing her email, watching a lifetime of ambition and work unravel in a devastating cascade of notifications. Her allies had melted into the crowd, her spotlight was extinguished, her kingdom had been dismantled. And at the center of it all stood Elena, calm and radiant, her wine-stained gown transformed from a mark of shame into an emblem of warrior resilience. She had walked into the room as a target. She would walk out as a legend. The verdict was final, billions gone, and with them, the carefully constructed illusion of Brittany Langford. What an incredible, unbelievable night. The dust is settling. But this story is far from over. What lesson will you take away from Elena Vargas's quiet strength? Let us know your thoughts in the comments. Every comment, like, and subscription helps us to find and share more of these powerful stories where dignity triumphs over arrogance. Thank you for being a part of this community. The ballroom was no longer a party. It was a courtroom after the sentence had been handed down. And Elena Vargas had no interest in lingering to watch the convicted unravel. That wasn't her way. Quiet power does not gloat. It simply executes its will and moves on, leaving echoes in its wake. She placed her linen napkin gently back on the table, a final deliberate act. She adjusted the folds of her indigo gown, straightened her shoulders, and began to walk toward the exit. The crowd parted for her as if by divine decree. No one spoke to her, no one dared to meet her eye. Some looked down in shame. Others watched her with a newfound reverence. Sophia kept her camera steady, whispering a final note, leaving on her own terms. The queen abdicates the throne she never wanted. Each click of her low heels on the marble floor sounded louder than any note the jazz band could ever play. It was louder than Brittany's cruel laughter had ever been. It was the sound of dignity reclaiming its space. Trembling, broken, Brittany made one last desperate attempt. "Wait!" she cried out, her voice thin and reedy. "Please, we can talk about this. We can fix this." Elena paused at the grand double doors, turning only her head to look back over her shoulder. Her voice, though still quiet, carried across the entire silent ballroom, a final indelible lesson for everyone present. "Respect," she said, "is not a line item in a negotiation. It is not available at any price. It is not negotiable. Not now, not ever." The words seemed to etch themselves into the air, into the memory of every person who heard them. Then she turned her back and walked away, unhurried, unshaken. The massive doors swung open before her as if bowing to her presence, and she stepped out into the cool night. The city lights below seemed to rush up to greet her, her indigo gown catching the glow as if it carried its own constellations within its threads. Behind her, a profound silence lingered, the kind of silence that doesn't just fade away. It settles, it reshapes, it redefines everything. Harlan Brooks lifted his glass one last time, his voice solemn. "Dignity," he said to his wife, "does not need a stage. It becomes one." Sophia lowered her phone, her heart still racing. She knew what tomorrow's headlines would be. Tech mogul humiliates wrong woman, loses multi-billion-dollar empire in a single night. But for Elena Vargas, as she settled into the quiet leather interior of her waiting car, there were no headlines in her mind. There was no sense of triumph, only a quiet, resolute sadness that such a display had been necessary. She was guided now, as she had always been, by the same steady promise she had made to herself as a girl standing in the rain. Never again would she shout for space in rooms that were designed to silence her. Instead, she would simply build the kind of power that made those rooms irrelevant. And, as the heavy car door closed, sealing her in a cocoon of silence, the glittering ballroom above, haunted by the quiet strength of the woman they had so spectacularly failed to dismiss, finally and forever became hers.